All right. I think we'll get rolling here. Is this close enough? Okay. I have a very fuzzy, charming microphone. All right, so welcome to one of our CAAD lunch gatherings. Delighted. I'm Brian Norwood. I'm one of the board members of CAAD. Delighted today to have Phoebe Lickwar here. She's an associate professor of landscape architecture. Works on a lot of amazing topics, including one we'll hear about today with agroecology and climate change. She's a principal at Forge Landscape Architecture, received the Rome Prize, as most of us know, 2 years ago now, and has published widely, exhibited photography widely. And her talk today is Out of the Ruins, Remnant, Agroecology, and Experimental Gardens for a Damaged Planet. So, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm thrilled to be here today. So I'd like to take this opportunity today to share some work in progress. I think that's kind of the ethic around the forum. And I'm going to try and leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A, so be thinking about what you'd like to ask. The conversation is my favorite part. So this work exists at the nexus of several intertwined threads. My research of traditional and contemporary practices of agroecology, my landscape architecture practice, informed by this research, and my thoughts on how landscape architecture education needs to change radically to equip students to shape landscapes in a time of everything crisis. In an effort to serve the growth machine and enlarge its significance, landscape architecture, like all design professions, has engaged in a fair amount of greenwashing. Laudable efforts have been made to accurately account for things like the true carbon cost of making a landscape. But at the same time, an entire body of knowledge, set of traditions, an enduring, resilient, and adaptive set of practices of shaping land to sustain life, all of which fall under the umbrella of agroecology, have been largely ignored. This knowledge, these traditions and practices, have historically fallen outside of the discipline. And yet one may argue they're far more effective strategies for living on the planet in a time of climate crisis. I want to say they're far more effective strategies for making landscapes. But I think this is where the problem begins, with the very idea of making landscape, as opposed to shaping or participating in landscape. Could we not, instead of making landscape, shape landscape responsibly with an ethic of thrift, care, and ingenuity that does not cause so much harm to the living soil, to plants and other organisms, or to humans? This is a big ask. We're actually quite far even from the aspiration to do no harm, let alone to amend or regenerate. What I'm talking about is a fairly massive shift in practice and also in education. This shift requires us to reach beyond the boundary of the discipline and to understand how we practice design in a much broader context, along a much longer scale of time. So my talk today is a beginning, an attempt to crack open the door to a new desire line, not an attempt to provide a solution. I have more questions than answers. Like all proposals at the radical end of the spectrum, there's no real clear path forward. There will be inevitably contradictions, imperfections, and compromise. So this is work in formation, work that seeks to develop an exchange between agroecology and landscape architecture. Hi, welcome. So my intent is to understand agroecology as a form of design and landscape architecture as a discipline that builds on agroecological practices to fuel a dialogue and create connections between designers and agriculturalists. I'm interested in the convergence of the garden and the farm, and in the garden as a form of agroecology. I'm suggesting that we develop new models of education and of practice that takes as a starting point the potential for promiscuity That is, for an exchange, a mixing of agroecology and landscape architecture. So I'd like to begin by talking about this incredible ancient Roman fresco from the Augustan age. It was unearthed from an underground room, a triclinium, which is essentially a dining room, at the Villa Livia, and is represented in a room of the same dimensions at the Palazzo Massimo in Rome. And if you're ever there, you must go see it. It's extraordinary for many reasons, and I'm very grateful for the work of scholar Julia Keneva, who has painstakingly identified all the species of plants. Here on the, on the left, you see an architectural plan. In the middle, a diagram showing the plant species analysis, and on the right, a photograph of the room before the frescoes were removed for safekeeping in the museum. And on the previous slide, it indicated, but in case you didn't see it, this is from the 1st century BC. Keneva has noted the imaginative, fantastical aspects of this work. Plants are blooming and fruiting all at the same time, though in reality this conflation of spring and fall would never happen. The imperial family chose a representation of the garden as a place providing sustenance, not only for humans, but others as well. Birds, for instance, feature prominently. Contrast this with the idea that the garden is purely ornamental and agricultural spaces lie beyond the city's boundary. I'm interested in the age of the plants and their form. They're juvenile and obviously pruned. So this is a garden that's been shaped by human hands. Just as it's not purely ornamental, it's also not wild, untouched nature or a bucolic agricultural landscape. It's an imaginative mixing of the three. This aspect of mixing, the convergence of the garden and the farm, is exactly what we do not find in the global extractive monoculture that's caused so much damage. Instead, we find systems designed to produce singular commodities for profit at any cost. With these extractive monocultures, we're well on our way to exhausting soils and diminishing biodiversity to the extent we can no longer grow enough food. So this is the depressing part. Extractive monocultures are threatening the future survival of humanity and other life forms across the planet. So a few statistics. 90% of the Earth's soil is likely to be degraded by 2050. That's not so far in the future. Agriculture is responsible for 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions and 30% of world energy consumption. And according to the UN, our global food system is the primary driver of biodiversity loss, with agriculture alone being the identified threat to 86% of species at risk of extinction. So it's obviously time to leave behind the urban-rural divide and start thinking about our consumption in terms of its impacts far from home when we don't take steps to feed ourselves locally. However, transposing the systems, forms, and practices of extractive monoculture to our cities in a kind of repurposed, modernist architecture fantasy will only reenact the same harms. So I'm suggesting this is exactly what we don't need. In 2021, there was an exhibition in France called Farmer Designers, Agriculture on the Move. The exhibition examines farming as a design practice, which was also the topic of my book, Farmscape. The curators talk about the reinvention of agriculture as a commitment to address the disruption of biodiversity and climate through the unique contextual practices united under the concept of agroecology. Farmers, like gardeners, grow landscapes. They shape land over time. Farming is an avenue for building knowledge and shaping land incrementally through lived experience. And practices of agroecology are practices of design in action, with many opportunities for experimentation and innovation. Agroecology is a powerful force for change when it integrates processes of care embedded in gardening with the growing of food that intimately connects us to the land as a source of life. In the fall of 2022, I took students in my advanced studio to the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and we attended a talk by the Palestinian-American geographer Omar Tesdell, in which he argued for the recognition and acknowledgement of remnant agroecological practices that have endured for thousands of years, surviving systems of oppression, land theft, and persecution. Tesdell asked how we might bring these remnants to bear on the current climate crisis. He suggested the need to not only study and activate these remnants now in the present, but also to create new formations for deep climate adaptation. So to me, this implies action on two fronts. First, the development of an agroecological literacy that celebrates and draws upon wisdom and knowledge held in remnants, ensuring it remains available to us in times to come. And second, the creation of new landscapes and new practices of shaping land that emerge alongside this knowledge to retain what's been most enduring and life-sustaining instead of what's been most harmful and ubiquitous. I continue to be inspired by Dr. Tesdell's work and the work of countless farmers, land stewards, scholars, scientists, and communities across the world who are working to preserve and share their knowledge for a viable agroecological future. So indigenous and local knowledge, also referred to as traditional ecological knowledge and various other terms, should be foregrounded in the context of design education. There's much to learn from local communities that hold such knowledge and much unlearning to be done within the academy and within landscape architecture practice. Scientists like Robin Wall-Kimmerer have warned about threats to indigenous and local knowledge systems and advocated for their inclusion in science education. They're also critical to the future of landscape architecture. In the fall of 2021, as Brian mentioned, I began my Rome Prize Fellowship with the intent to study and document one such land-based local knowledge system in Italy, a form of agroecology that's said to have been practiced by the Etruscans, but which may have an even longer history originating with the Assyrians. This system of mixed cultivation of trees, vines, and arable crops was based upon symbiotic relationships between plants, animals, soil, and water. It was a defining feature of the Italian landscape north of Naples until the 1960s. I was primarily interested in the architectural formation, that is, the complexity in the vertical section, and the way it supports symbiotic relations between plants, people, soils, and animals. But what I didn't know at the time I proposed the project was whether there were any remnants left. I had read about preserved remnants in the north of Italy, but nothing in the regions of central Italy or to the south. So as I began my research, I was immersed in the everyday remnants of an agricultural city. Rome has always been a city of cultivated land. In fact, the word vigna, as I learned from Mirka Benes, was used interchangeably to mean garden, vineyard, or kitchen garden. Romans, it seemed, did not distinguish. This is on the Appia Antica, a common everyday occurrence. And historians have written about this polycultural system, also known as the cultura promiscua, which is Italian for mixed cultures, essentially polyculture. And here you see its range, stretching largely from Campania, the region of Campania north, with a few instances further south, noted in 1957. It was adaptable to soils and climate, with different species of trees playing the prominent role of supporting grapevines. As noted, in 1929, there were elms and poplars in the south, maple, elm, and olive in the central region, and willow, elm, mulberry, hazelnut, ash, and other fruit trees in the north. And sadly, elms, like in this country, in the north, have succumbed to disease everywhere but in the south of Italy. But other than that, I found this map to be largely accurate still today. What's so incredible to think about is how the landscape was once a continuous woodland, a mosaic of diverse formations of trees, vines, and other plants shaped by people in response to unique characteristics of geomorphology. The transformation of land that happened in the mid-20th century was an eradication of biodiverse woodland and the substitution of specialized monoculture in its place. The woodland, infinite in its diversity of form, which I'll show in a bit, served the specific needs of people and formed a tradition based upon renewability, whereby soil, water, and species were conserved and supported. So you're seeing on the left what it looked like, this variable woodland, and then on the right, the current condition where the kind of architecture, if we can call it that, is separated out. So we have olive orchards, grape vineyards, and wheat fields, all on separate parcels of land, no longer intermixed. The practice of mixed cultures requires a tremendous amount of knowledge, skill, and labor to ensure the mutual benefit between species and to facilitate the symbiotic relationships. For instance, the trees are pruned to permit light to reach the grapes and to collect fodder for animals who graze the fields. Planting and harvesting are timed to diminish interference between crops, with wheat harvested in June and grapes in October. So this shows the range of my study in the darker tone, from Naples to, or from Campania to Tuscany. And it really was a process of finding a kind of needle in a haystack, looking for these remnants, searching for them using aerial photography, a combination of aerial photography, old maps, the research of scholars that I happened to stumble across, and then just driving the countryside, searching on foot. So if you move through the countryside in Italy, this is a common site. It's the dominant specialized system of cultivation, intensively specialized fields of grapes or olives, trained on trellises and managed without regard for their natural morphology or their proclivity for mixing with different species. The grapes on the right are maintained at a very low height, and the olives on the left are pruned and trained as a low hedge. Both methods, with their diminished vertical architecture, are problematic. The grapes for their susceptibility to frost and drought with a changing climate, and the Espelide olives for their short lifespan. When they're grown this way, they only live 15 to 20 years. And as you know, this is a species that can live for thousands. So these are some images, some photographs that I made that show the diversity of this practice in the central part of Italy. And so often the trees are in rows, but they can also be planted along the contour where it's more hilly. So it's very responsive to topography. It's responsive to climate and soils, and then also to local tradition. The species of the trees change, and thus does the form, the way that the vines climb on the trees. And these remnants are situated largely in a kind of sea of monoculture, right? close to small rural towns, and still maintained today, either by a younger generation of winemakers or very elderly landowners who have been cultivating the practice their whole lives. So I'd like to focus on one area in particular, that of the Agroecology, which is a region that stretches across the province of Naples and Caserta to the south of Rome. This area is known, unfortunately, as the Triangle of Death for the public health crisis that has emerged in the wake of decades of illegal dumping of urban, industrial, and toxic waste by the Camorra Mafia, who formed agreements with manufacturers in Italy and beyond, earning billions of dollars in the process. It's also commonly referred to as the land of fires because of the illegal burning of toxic waste alongside the dumping. It's estimated that 10 million tons of toxic garbage have been buried in this region since the early 1990s, leaching into the soil and groundwater. Public health studies show elevated rates of cancer and leukemia. And despite public outrage and now data that has emerged over decades of study that shows the consequences of the contamination, the situation seems stalled. It's in this context that communities are fighting to preserve their cultural heritage. In addition to the waste crisis, rampant development has swallowed up land that was once planted and cared for in this tradition. A group in the town of Chiesa has been fighting to gain UNESCO recognition to preserve the remnants that are left. And winemakers in the area, like this one, I Borboni, are also struggling to preserve small remnants from which they make the region's famous Asprigna wine. So these are maps showing the context and location of the remnants that I documented, and they are all greater than 1 hectare in size, which is actually very rare. The more common sort of remnant is actually just a single row of trees or a very small fragment. And then this is what those gardens look like. Again, the species of trees change, but it's largely elms and poplars. And this land is flat, so they are planted in rows. And it's a really hyper-diverse mix of species besides the trees and the grapevines. The grapevines are trained to be 12 to 15 meters tall, so that's almost 45 feet tall. It's quite extraordinary. And there are often fruit trees integrated into the rows of vines. So they make these really amazing curtains as you walk through them. There is a ladder called the scalilo, which is built specifically to each person who harvests grapes. So the distance between the rungs is the exact distance between the knee and the foot, so that you can harvest, with your hands free and hold on to the ladder with your leg. So alongside these traditions of preservation, there's a small but growing movement to invent new gardens, resisting crises of pollution, monoculture, and urban development. And I wanted to see this for myself, so last fall I returned to Italy and traveled to another region further south that has experienced devastation of a different sort. I was guided by two photographers, the work of two photographers, Jean-Marc Caimi and Valentina Piccini, whose book Fastidiosa documents the biological, cultural, and personal devastation that's happened in the region of Puglia, a place famous for its ancient olives. Over 10 years, an estimated 21 million olive trees have succumbed to the bacteria Xylella fastidiosa, which is transferred from tree to tree by this insect. The loss of livelihood and cultural heritage is tragic, and Xylella is still advancing 12 miles every year. We can read here many different stories, but I'll point to two of them, which are relevant to our discussion today. The danger of monoculture, of an ecology that's out of balance, which favors pest accumulation, and the deep cultural intertwining of humans and trees. I didn't linger in the fields of trees, dead trees, however, because my purpose was not to research or document the tragedy, but instead to discover the small but powerful revolution that's rising up in response. A community of ecologists, farmers, and people concerned about the degradation of land in the Salento are growing future forests out of the ruins of pest-driven decline. Practicing syntropic agriculture or successional agroforestry, groups like X-Farm and this one, Amadeco, are quite literally growing a new landscape in and amongst the dead and dying olives, testing new approaches that are adaptive to climate change and restoring degraded land. So here you see the olive orchard. These olives are dead, and they're growing a garden within them. Principles of successional agroforestry we can see at work here include a multi-strata organization in the vertical section, keeping the soil covered at all times, the use of nurse plants, and human intervention at key points in time to hasten succession. So for instance, pruning time to stimulate growth, to choreograph nutrient cycling, and to ensure the right amount of sunlight reaches the lower strata. This kind of agriculture requires deep knowledge of plant behavior and plant relations, and it also requires a lot of human labor. The behavior of plants and their relationships with each other, along with the microbial life of the soil, guides human participation in the shaping of the architecture of the landscape. These gardens also capitalize on the juvenile phase of a plant's life to generate biomass and increase fertility. In a project I completed about 5 years ago, we were also interested in this juvenile phase and on creating a garden that would counter the logics of extractive monocrop agriculture. This garden, designed and built for the Chaumont International Garden Festival, offered a space for people to experience the aliveness of juvenile trees that are typically raised as crops. The garden features as its protagonists tree species that are bred and mined for biofuel production, trees that are typically planted in a process of short rotation coppicing. So they're being harvested here, they cut at the ground, and then the trees resprout, and it starts all over again. So this shows the diversity of species in the garden, its shape and form, its seasonal change, and transposed to the garden, the juvenile trees are seen as experienced not as commodities valued for their utility, but in terms of their fertility, growth, and sociality. We used poplar, willow, maple, alder, and locust, and these trees live in a community with other forest understory plants and with each other. They grow rapidly, which is why they're so successful as a crop, up to 6 feet in one growing season, and they did grow 6 feet while they were in this garden. And this growth can be understood as a characteristic of their youth here, not as a measure of profit. In the garden, a playful experience provides a way to see the trees in a less instrumental way, to sense their aliveness and witness their youth, and to consider how they form communities of living beings, both human and more than human, and how they create environments that impact our physical and mental well-being, allowing us to connect with others. So I'm going to end with a current project that's at a completely different scale. It's experimental in nature and embodies the ethic and approach of the syntropic gardens in Puglia, although not a syntropic garden itself. The project is an effort to reestablish bottomland hardwood forest on marginal agricultural land across the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. And the initial goal of the project was to reforest 50,000 acres over 10 years. So it's opportunistic in nature, looking for the most marginal and degraded farmland, and making transformation bit by bit. This is a land of extraction, primarily cotton, soy, and oil, as far as the eye can see. And the first site, this first site in Louisiana is 1,000 acres. Marginal farmland means it floods more often than not. So even though it is conventionally farmed, very often the crop cannot be recouped from the land. And here you see aerial photographs that show the deforestation. On the left, it's the forest that existed in 1940. And then in the 60s, commodity soybean prices shot up, and immediately people came through this region of the country and cut down the forests and burned the trees on site, didn't even stop to salvage the lumber. And then today, the condition, which is a very intense hydrological modification. So even though this land is, and these soils and these plants are very dependent on seasonal inundation, talking about any kind of restoration back to some original condition is very difficult because of the modifications of or control of hydrology. The site is very tied to the sites around it, and so it's a kind of Frankenstein situation. This is what it looks like. I've never been to a more inhospitable place. It is scaleless. It's hot. There's nothing, well, at this time, there was nothing really living. The soils are basically sterile after 60 years of application of chemical fertilizers and herbicides. Our second site is in northeast Arkansas, and it's 1,600 acres, which has been grazed, heavily overgrazed, and then planted with this grass that you see, miscanthus grass, which was planted for biofuel. The government, the USDA, offered a program to farmers, a one-time payout for them to plant miscanthus grass across their land, which unfortunately made their land unfarmable. It was to develop a source for biofuel, but the infrastructure was never built. So it could never be harvested and used in that way. The land can't be grazed because animals won't eat it. And it grows to 12 feet in one growing season, so it shades out other plants. Additionally, the roots of that one single plant are not very good at holding the soils like a prairie would be or a forest. And so this is the condition of erosion across the site that we're facing. This is the forest in this area of Arkansas. It's on Crowley's Ridge, which is a geological anomaly. It is, has a topographic elevation and a sort of hilly landscape, even though it is within the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. So our proposal is actually to try to diminish or starve out the miscanthus using these guys, herds of goats. It's slow, and it will take, the plan is to do this over 3 years. So a decision that's made within an instant, right, or within a month or a week causes a kind of degradation that then can take decades to repair. In Louisiana, we've started with a soils analysis. We're also measuring carbon, soil carbon, and how our land restoration efforts are influencing the amount of carbon in the soil. So we went last spring and collected samples, and we're working with a geologist here at UT, Dan Breeker, and his lab to measure the carbon in the soils. So this kind of work, as opposed to conventional practice, is really slow, and it's difficult because of that. You know, finding a way for the time scale of this project to match the time scale of the interest of a client, or even funding resources is pretty difficult. As I mentioned, it takes a really long time. You have to wait over multiple growing seasons to sort of seed, to plant tree seedlings, and then to continuously care for the land as it's progressing. And there's a fair amount of unpredictability and need to kind of retool in response to what happens. And I think in the end, it's a way of working that's much more like a farmer than like a designer and installer, again, as is typical in conventional practice. So with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions.